Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Very shortly, we will hear from Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He said earlier on in the House of Commons, we've got to learn to live with COVID. He's announced the end of all restrictions. In future, we will treat catching COVID like catching flu, which of course means that people should exercise personal responsibility. So let's have a look before and we await a press conference, and as soon as the Prime Minister takes that podium, we will cut to him. But let's have a look at the main point the Prime Minister made in the House of Commons this afternoon.
We now have sufficient levels of immunity to complete the transition from protecting people with government interventions to relying on vaccines and treatments as our first line of defence. We will encourage people with COVID-19 symptoms to exercise personal responsibility, just as we encourage people who may have flu to be considerate to others.
So, we treat COVID as being endemic, not epidemic. Let us cross now, live to Downing Street, to hear from the Prime Minister.
We had little knowledge of this virus and none about the vaccines and the treatments we have today. So there was no option but to use government regulations to protect our NHS and save lives. But those restrictions on our liberties have brought grave costs to our economy, our society, and the chances of our children. So from the outset, we were clear that we must chart a course back towards normality as rapidly as possible by developing the vaccines and treatments that could gradually replace those restrictions. And as a result of possibly the greatest national effort in our peacetime history, that is exactly what we have done. Thanks to our brilliant scientists, thanks to the extraordinary men and women of our NHS, and to every one of you who has come forward to get jabbed and get boosted, the United Kingdom has become the first country in the world to administer an approved vaccine and the fastest major European nation to roll out both the vaccines and the booster to half our population. We've emerged from the teeth of the pandemic before many others, retaining one of the most open economies and societies in Europe, the fastest growth in the G7 last year. And while the pandemic is not over, we have passed the peak of the Omicron wave, with cases falling and hospitalisations in England now fewer than 10,000 and still falling. And so now we have the chance to complete that transition back towards normality, while maintaining the contingencies to respond to a resurgence or a new variant. As we have done throughout the past 2 years, we'll continue to work with the devolved administrations as they decide how to take forward their own plans. In England, we will remove all remaining domestic restrictions in law. From this Thursday, it will no longer be law to self-isolate if you test positive, and so we will also end the provision of self-isolation support payments, although statutory sick pay can still be claimed for a further month. If you're a fully vaccinated close contact or under 18, you will no longer be asked to test daily for 7 days. And if you're a close contact who is not fully vaccinated, you will no longer be required to self-isolate. Until April the 1st, we will still advise you to stay at home if you test positive, but after that, we will encourage people with COVID and with COVID symptoms to exercise personal responsibility, just as we encourage people who may have flu to be considerate towards others. It's only because levels of immunity are so high and deaths are now, if anything, below where you would normally expect for this time of year that we can lift these restrictions. And it's only because we know Omicron is less severe that testing for Omicron on the colossal scale that we have been doing is now much less valuable in preventing serious illness. We should be proud that the UK established the biggest testing programme per person of any large country in the world, but its budget in the last financial year was bigger than that of the Home Office. And it cost, the testing programme cost £2 billion just last month alone. So we must scale back and prioritise our resources for the most vulnerable. From today, staff and students in most education and childcare settings will no longer be asked to undertake twice weekly asymptomatic testing. And from the 1st of April, we will end free symptomatic and asymptomatic testing for the general public. But we will continue providing free symptomatic tests to those at the highest risk from COVID. And in line with the practice of many other countries, we're working with retailers to ensure you will always be able to buy a test. We should be clear that the pandemic is not over, and there may be significant resurgences. Our scientists are certain that there will be new variants, and it is very possible that those will be worse than Omicron. So we will continue to protect the most vulnerable with targeted vaccinations and treatments. And we've bought enough doses of vaccine to anticipate a wide range of possible JCVI recommendations. Today, this includes a new spring booster, which will be offered to those aged 75 and over, older care home residents, and those over 12 who are immunosuppressed. We will also retain disease surveillance systems and contingency measures, which can ensure our resilience in the face of future waves or new variants. And we will build on the innovations that defined the very best of our response to the pandemic, including continuing the work of the Vaccines Task Force, which has already secured contracts with manufacturers trialling new vaccines which could provide protection against new variants. Today is not the day we can declare victory over COVID, because this virus is not going away. But it is the day when all the efforts of the last 2 years finally enabled us to protect ourselves whilst restoring our liberties in full. And after 2 of the darkest, grimmest years in our peacetime history, I do believe this is a moment of pride for our nation and a source of hope for all that we can achieve in the years to come. Thank you very much. I think Patrick's going to do Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. First slide, please. The first slides are ones which have been shown before but updated. So the first slide is the number of people testing positive for COVID in the UK. And as you can see, although the Omicron wave is now going down, it reached an extraordinarily high peak. And the number of people still with Omicron is still very high. And people, including elderly and vulnerable people, are still being infected. Next slide, please. The number of people in hospital with COVID in the UK is again still significant, and this is still in many hospitals providing quite a lot of pressure on NHS services. But the rates are now going down and have been going down steadily now for some weeks. I think it's important to acknowledge that, as with the last peak, and in this peak, it would have been considerably higher had people not listened to advice and been careful not to transmit to other people where it was avoidable, in particularly to protect vulnerable people. So this is, I just wanted to say this would have been a lot worse without that. But this peak was significant in hospitalisations, and those who say that this is a trivial disease, I think, need to look at how many people were in hospital and still are going into hospital with Omicron. Next slide, please. On the other hand, fortunately, the number of people who have died with a positive test for Omicron, and of course some of these will not have died of Omicron, but many have, was much smaller than the previous peak, although every death is a tragedy for the individual and for the families. This is now steadily going down. Next slide, please. And as a result of the extraordinary work of the NHS, volunteers and people coming forward, we had a very rapid increase in boosting, which the fact that people were able to take precautions before and around Christmas time bought time for the boosting of the population and in particular the boosting of the elderly and vulnerable population. This is continuing. People are still coming forward for their first, second and booster vaccinations, but that extraordinary upswing saved many people from going to hospital and will have saved also many lives. Next slide, please. I just wanted to make a couple of comments on the impact of vaccination on severity. There is no doubt that even with Omicron, which is a less severe variant in the vaccinated, being vaccinated significantly reduces in every age band the risk of going into hospitalisation, into hospital. And this is shown on this graph here. And if you look around the world at countries where Omicron waves are ongoing, and where elderly populations have lower vaccination rates, the rate of hospitalisation is substantially higher. Next slide, please. I think even more striking is what happens when we get into the most severe patients who go into in intensive care, ICU. And what this graph shows up going up to the age of 70, after that the data becomes slightly less easy to interpret because of confounding factors. But what you can see is the purple bars are the people, is the proportions relative to the population who are unvaccinated, and the very low bars there that you can see almost invisible are the proportions relative to the population in people who are vaccinated with a first, second or booster dose, demonstrating really clearly that you can be hospitalised, you can go to ICU, but that vaccination is a very substantial protection. Next slide, please. I'd finally like to just make a couple of comments on the relative importance of Omicron as a cause of mortality at the moment. And if you, the first way of showing this is looking all the way back to the beginning of the pandemic. And this is showing weekly registered deaths. This is all deaths. This is not just COVID deaths. And in orange are the ones where COVID is mentioned on the death certificate. And what you can see is really big peaks, which occurred in the first and second waves, and a prolonged but much lower peak in the Delta wave due to vaccination. And then you still have people who are dying with COVID at the moment, but the dotted line, the purple line, is the average number of people you'd expect to be dying at this time of year. And as you can see, the total number of deaths now, if you combine Omicron and everything else, is now slightly lower than the average seasonal average you would expect at this time of year. And to show this a slightly different, and before I pass on actually, just to point out, very large numbers of people, much higher proportion, are dying of other things. And that is a key part of the considerations for how we need to think about the next 9 months. Last slide, please. And this is a slightly different way of showing the same data. And what it shows is the really extraordinarily large waves of excess mortality. This is for all causes that coincided with the first, second and Delta waves, but actually a relatively small impact. In fact, in absolute terms, a slight decrease relative to the average for this time of year over the years that preceded the COVID pandemic. So I thought it was just worth highlighting that, because this does demonstrate that in a highly vaccinated population, with Omicron, which is a less severe variant than previous ones, the impact on overall all-cause mortality has been much more muted, in fact, essentially not visible compared to the previous waves. Now, I thought because there are some changes now, I'd just like to make some additional kind of forward views about what's going to happen, and then Patrick is going to add a few as well. The first is just to say something about the Omicron wave. The Omicron wave is still high. And if you look around the UK, we're still in places, we're still between 1 in 20 and 1 in 25 people have got Omicron if they were tested according to NS data, which is slightly backward looking. Now, the rates are coming down, but this is still a very common infection. And it is important to view the next period when we will still have testing all the way up to April, and which changes are happening, in fact, in steps. People think about this as one big step. This is a gradual, steady change over a period of time as the rates are going down and as we head into spring. And I think it's important to understand that context. This is not a sudden everything stops. This is a steady move. The next thing it's important to acknowledge is that we all expect, and Patrick will talk more about this, there to be new variants. And some of those new variants will just disappear, but some of them will cause us significant problems, and they could be either more vaccine escaping, but as severe as Omicron, but the net effect would be actually more people end up in hospital because a lot of our protections are from vaccination, or it could be more intrinsically severe because Omicron came from a much earlier variant, and Patrick will talk a bit more about this. So we could certainly end up with something which is more likely to lead to hospitalisations than Omicron, and therefore we need to be very careful, as the Prime Minister said, and have both our surveillance and our ability to ramp up with us. And then finally, just as the good news is things are going down as we head into spring, we do have to accept that the respiratory season next winter and in subsequent winters is likely to combine COVID, whatever variants are circulating there, flu and all the other respiratory problems. So we expect the winters to be tricky even in the absence of significant new variants. And the vaccination programme that JCVI will consider will take that into account. And the implications of this are, as we look at the next weeks, we still have high rates of Omicron, and I would urge people in terms of public health advice, and this is very much the government's position, that people should still, if they have COVID, try to prevent other people getting it, and that means self-isolating. So that is the public health advice. It would have been the public health advice and will be the public health advice for multiple other diseases. If you had norovirus, we would give exactly the same public health advice. So this is standard public health advice for a significant and highly transmissible infection. All the things that people have done so well and have thought about so systematically remain important. Maximising ventilation, hand washing, and for the period when there are still significant numbers of cases, at least, using masks in enclosed spaces with large numbers of other people is a sensible way of helping to reduce the risk to others. As rates go down, the relative benefit of these kind of things will change. But at this point, while the rates are very high, this remains sensible, pragmatic advice, which everybody knows about and everybody can continue to follow. And this is part of the steady movement towards a new phase of managing this virus. And we must have three things. We must have good surveillance, as the Prime Minister said, to ensure that when new variants start to take off, or when we start to see new surges, we know where they are and we can respond in a targeted and rapid way to make sure we deal with them before they cause significant problems for individuals and for the NHS. We must have the capacity rapidly to step up in terms of what we're doing, and we must be able to protect the most vulnerable. And those really are the critical things that we need to maintain even beyond this next few weeks into the rest of this year and the rest of the way that we continue to manage this epidemic. Patrick was going to expand a bit on the issues in particular around variation.
Yeah, thank you. So, very clear, this pandemic is not over, and it's carrying on around the world, and we're not out of it here yet. The virus is continuing to evolve. So, every variant is an evolution, and the virus has got a lot of room to evolve. And it will continue to do so quite fast, probably for the next couple of years. Those changes will alter the properties of the virus. There is no guarantee that the next variant is as reduced severity as Omicron. It could be the same, it could be more, it could be less. So as it evolves, what it's trying to do is transmit more readily, to grow. So that could be because it has got intrinsic transmissibility advantage, or it escapes immunity. And the change in severity is a random byproduct. So we expect there to be further variants, and they could be more severe. As Chris has said, if you look at Omicron, actually, with the immunity we've got in the population, the level of severe illness and death has been dramatically reduced. And that's the reason across the world people are beginning to release measures. It's not just here, everyone is beginning to release measures. But in order to do that safely, there are some things that need to be in place. The first is it's absolutely essential to have a way of detecting it, a good surveillance system. And we're lucky that we have a very good surveillance system in this country, the ONS study, which is a way of picking up across the population, both at a national level and at a regional level and in different age groups, what is happening, and that detection system is going to be vital. The second thing that's important is being able to respond quickly. So the resilience and the ability to ramp up is absolutely crucial, and that doesn't mean ramp up over months. If something goes wrong, you need to be able to ramp up very quickly. Just remember how quickly Omicron took off. That tells you you've got a couple of weeks to get things back in action. So once you take things off, it's going to be important to know how quickly you can put them back on again and to get them back in shape in time to be able to deal with it. And the third is, throughout all of that, there's a sections of the population who remain vulnerable at all times, and it's important that they are protected, both in terms of their ability to detect the illness, the ability to get antiviral treatments quickly, and of course the protection that everyone gets from vaccination. So detect, respond, and protect the most vulnerable is absolutely crucial during a period of reducing the measures that are in place and being careful about how that goes in relation to what is an evolving virus, with a period of quite unstable evolution over the next year or more. These measures are going to be important to give the safety net. And as an American colleague put it at the weekend, he said, you can celebrate when the sun's shining, but take your umbrella with you. And I think that's really the message.
Good. I think that sums it up very well. Thank you very much. Let's go to questions from the public first. Nicole from the West Midlands.
Looking at the data, it would appear that COVID-19 hospitalisations are currently at a similar level to what we saw in October 2020, just before we entered a second lockdown. Should we now be putting in place more measures to protect the NHS?
Well, thanks, Nicole. I'm going to ask Chris and Patrick to have a go at that as well. But I will just say that the big difference between then and now, Nicole, is that the number of hospitalisations is on a clear downward trend, and the number of people in ICU is as a proportion of those going into hospital is much smaller, and you'll have seen the fatality numbers that we're seeing, which are very different from what we experienced under previous waves. So it's clear that Omicron is very different and milder in the way that it behaves, and that's one of the reasons, in addition to the vaccines that we have, the high level of vaccine-induced and other immunity. That's one of the reasons we can do what we're doing. But Chris,
I mean, I completely agree with obviously the Prime Minister's answer. I mean, I think the three things to acknowledge. The first of which is, it is certainly the case that there are hospitals in the UK which are still under significant pressure as a result of Omicron, and I think we should be really clear about that. But, and this is the big difference, the first big difference, the trajectory is definitely down at the moment, and it is steadily down and has been for some time. A way to go, but that is the direction of travel, very different to where we found ourselves in previous periods. And secondly, the proportion of those people who, having entered hospital, then end up in intensive care or getting into deep trouble, and in some cases sadly dying, is a very much smaller proportion as a result of vaccination, which we didn't have in October 2020, and of a less severe variant.
Thanks. Gemma from Greater London.
As a pregnant woman, I'm told by the NHS website that I'm more likely to suffer a serious illness if I catch COVID, and in the third trimester it could also affect my baby. With the plans to remove COVID restrictions being brought forward, what are the recommendations for women like me and for other clinically vulnerable people? For the sake of removing social distancing and wearing masks, are we effectively being told to stay inside and remove ourselves from the world?
Gemma, no, and I think that what everybody needs to do is make sure that they treat people who may be vulnerable in any way with the utmost consideration, and you know, we've got to if we're symptomatic with any disease, you should treat vulnerable people with with courtesy and avoid spreading it. What we also want to make sure is that people who are clinically vulnerable do continue to have access to tests so that they can know whether they may have COVID and also get the therapeutics that they need depending on what their condition is. But
could I just add one point, Prime Minister, which is it is really clear now that vaccination in pregnancy is a very good thing to do for you, a very good thing to do for your unborn baby, and new data demonstrating that it's actually also a very good thing to do for your newborn baby. There is now data that shows that it provides protection for newborns. So essentially, it's protecting both you and your baby, and I would really, really want to use the opportunity, Gemma, of your question, to encourage anybody who is pregnant and has not been vaccinated, please, to do so.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Because I think there was a while when there was quite a lot of folklore against vaccination for pregnant women, and that was really not right at all. Thanks very much. Laura Koonsberg, BBC News.
Now, if you want to go on watching the Q&A, and the Q&A may well go on for a very long time, you can follow it on GB News' Facebook page. As it is, we're going to come back with some immediate comment. Celebrate while the sun is shining, but take your umbrella with you. They were the last words of that press conference from Sir Patrick Vallance. And it is, of course, almost exactly 2 years to the day that Boris Johnson first addressed the nation. Now, during that time, there were many of us who thought to begin with they didn't get it right at all. 18 million people flew into the country, none of them tested, none of them asked to quarantine. And then when we did decide to get tough, well, many of us thought the lockdowns went on far, far too long. But do you know what? Despite the scaremongering, despite all of it, what we can say is that we really are the first country to say we are ending all restrictions. We are effectively treating COVID-19 as an endemic problem, rather like seasonal flu, as opposed to it being an epidemic. Now, there are warnings, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance both saying during that press conference, look, there will be more variants, there could be serious variants, and the fourth jab will be available for the over 75s very shortly, whatever you may think of that. I think this is a great victory. It's a great victory for a free press. And we do actually have a free press in this country. And there are people on stations like this allowed to give their point of view. And we've argued, many of us here at GB News have argued for a long time that these restrictions needed to be ended. It's also a victory for the backbench rebels in Parliament. Yes, Boris Johnson can claim credit for us being the first country to approve a vaccine and to begin a rollout, something that could not have happened had it not been for Brexit. Whether Boris Johnson can claim ownership of these new freedoms, I'm not quite so sure. It was only a few weeks ago he was talking about the Omicron emergency. I think the backbenchers made him seriously reconsider his position. Either way, I believe today is a day of celebration. Keir Starmer doesn't agree. He thinks the whole thing has happened far too quickly and without caution, and we'll see how the devolved administrations act. I'm asking you, and give me your reaction, is Johnson right to have done this today? I absolutely, emphatically think that he is. Well, joining me, some immediate reaction on this. Firstly, David Livermore, Professor in Medical Microbiology at the Norwich Medical School. David, good evening.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Pleasure to be with you, Nigel. Pleasure.
Thank you. You've seen the press conference. You've seen what Boris Johnson, Sir Chris Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallance have had to say. I just would like to get your immediate reaction, please.
Well, it's a welcome development that finally these restrictions are being brought to an end. My view is that they should have been brought to an end a very, very long time ago. They're moving to a sort of focused protection of the vulnerable. That's what those of us who signed the Great Barrington Declaration right back in October of 2020 were recommending then. What can one say? Better late than never. we really cannot go on as we have been. You've thanked the Tory backbenchers who brought pressure on the government. I would thank them too. But I would also thank the virus, which did us a massive favour in South Africa in the tail end of last year by mutating into a milder variant, which clearly doesn't carry the mortality risk of earlier variants.
That's true. But when we look back, David, when we take the historical sweep and we look, and let's hope to goodness that was the last ever COVID press conference, I mean, everything crossed. When we look back at all of this, will we view lockdown as a success or a failure of government policy? What will be, in your opinion, right now, our long-term perspective on the last 2 years?
I believe it will be viewed as a catastrophic failure. It was not part of the pre-pandemic planning. It has cost a fortune, about 400 billion in debt, tax increases, inflation to pay for that. And the recent analysis by the Johns Hopkins University in the States suggested a minimal number of lives were saved. And that's at the price also, forget the economic cost for a moment, mental health, educations, other healthcare. Vast damage has been done by something which worldwide we went into in a panic in the March of 2020.
Strong words there from David Livermore. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your reaction to that press conference. Let's go to Sally Cutler, medical microbiology at the University of East London. We've spoken before, Sally, on this programme. Do you think this is too much too soon?
Well, I think that the strategy is correct. I think it is time to start thinking about our life with COVID, because it's not going anywhere. We do need to move on. We do need to progress. And we're now in a stronger place than we were. So I think now is the time to start thinking of this strategy. But I think that the plans are not quite fully fledged yet. So I think actually the implementation shouldn't be this Thursday, for instance. It should actually potentially have been at the end of March or possibly even Easter. And so I think basically they haven't thought it quite through yet. They don't know quite which groups they're going to allow to have access to free testing still. I think from the speeches that were given just a moment ago, it was very clear that they actually say we have to protect the vulnerable, but they haven't decided how they're going to do that. Boris Johnson earlier this afternoon was saying, yes, there'll be provision of free testing for the extremely vulnerable, but they haven't actually defined who those extremely vulnerable people actually are. Does it include the pregnant ladies? Does it include sort of the older people? And I've got a pitch invasion going on here.
That's all right. It adds to the joy of live television. Sally, I mean, they are saying, of course, aren't they? I mean, one area they have identified today is that for the over 75s, in a couple of months' time, a fourth jab will be available. Is that welcome news, in your opinion?
Yes and no. I say yes because the vaccine does wane over time, and this age group would have had their booster shot sort of September, October, and so their protection is now pretty well down at the bottom end. So basically we need to boost that up again. My hesitation is in the fact that, is the current vaccine the right one to be doing that fourth shot with? Should we actually be moving to a sort of polyvalent approach where we've got sort of a vaccine that's actually going to cover a number of different variants? And so I think really we need to evolve our vaccines as the virus is evolving. And so we do need to improve on what we've actually got. Obviously, it takes time to do that because the new variants are popping up and they have to do the adaptations, and then you have to check safety and efficacy before you can actually start rolling out the vaccine in the general population. But I think we really need to be moving towards evolving our vaccine, and then maybe we might get better durability, a better longevity of that vaccination response. Because
well, I hope
every
so.
few months,
Otherwise, Sally, it becomes like the flu jab, doesn't it? Otherwise, we're going to be told to get vaccinated every single year against COVID and against flu?
Yes, well, at the moment, flu is only once a year. COVID's 3 times a year, 4 times a year.
Yeah.
So basically, that is too much. That's not sustainable.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we need to do better on developing the vaccine. And also, the vaccine hasn't really inhibited transmission. It's reduced severity. Can we improve on the vaccine? Can we actually reduce transmission a bit better as well? So that would be a goal to really look for. So I'd like to see us improving on the vaccines.
Well, I think we all would. Sally, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, Boris Johnson first made these statements in the House of Commons earlier on today, 4:30 this afternoon. Let's just see what the response was from Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
The Prime Minister promised to present a plan for living with COVID. But all we've got today is yet more chaos and disarray. Not enough to prepare us for the new variants which may yet develop. An approach which seems to think that living with COVID means simply ignoring it.
Well, there we are. That was the Leader of the Opposition, pretty much an Eeyore today. But in a parliament that these days has so little humour, so few MPs, even capable, it seems, of speaking off the cuff. They normally stand there with their notes. There was one joyous intervention this afternoon, and it came from the Conservative Member of Parliament for Ashfield, Lee Anderson.
Unlike the opposition, the Prime Minister has got all the big decisions right through the pandemic. But will he agree with me that we should never return to a full lockdown and any isolation should be targeted? It should be the clinically vulnerable, the elderly and the Labour front bench.
There you are. You might agree or disagree with Lee Anderson, but there was at least a bit of humour. And a bit of humour on a day that I think is one that we really should celebrate. I mean, compare this to what's going on in Canada, where over the course of the weekend, Prime Minister Trudeau has used the most extraordinary bullying methods of breaking down a peaceful trucker protest. Not a Black Lives Matter protest, not setting fire, looting, people being shot. No, a peaceful protest threatening to take away the truckers' pets, threatening they could even be euthanized, freezing bank accounts, smashing lorries of windows to get people out of their trucks. I have to say, a lot of people have written to me over the weekend to ask why the Governor-General, the Queen's representative, hasn't had a word with Trudeau. Perhaps she has. I don't actually know. All I can tell you is we are the first country that is out and free of this. Yes, there is a risk, and that was made clear by Whitty and Valance today and by Boris Johnson. There is a risk of new variants, but I don't see us ever locking down fully again. And my own view is we will look back on this and say we made some dreadful mistakes, but we're out of it. And actually, you know what? If we were still members of the European Union, we'd have found it very much more difficult to make that decision today. Some audience reaction from you. One viewer says, yes, Boris has got this right. Most of us aren't bothered by abiding by stupid rules. Glad to see them confined to the dustbin where they belong. Emden says, time to move on. 2 years of this is long enough. Hear, hear. Another says, they should never have imposed this in the first place. Adam says to me, the government should keep testing free for the most vulnerable as indicated today. So why all the hysteria? It's still in the guidance to isolate, just not legally binding. Yeah, and it's common sense, isn't it? I mean, if you've got really, really bad dose of flu, would you really travel on a crowded commuter train? Would you really come in to a full, busy office? I hope not. Bobby says, Boris is the only leader I trust. Well, in a moment, we will talk to somebody, a former model, who's been a very, very prominent anti-lockdown campaigner. We're going to speak to Leliana Dowding. Let's see if she, like me, is celebrating today.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
It's time for Talking Pints. I'm joined by Lalani Dowding. Lalani, welcome.
Thank you. Cheers.
Very good to see you. Thank you. The most unusual Christian name I've ever come across.
Yeah, it's actually Hawaiian. My mum's from the Philippines. I don't know why I have a Hawaiian name, but it's always been wrong through school. No one can ever pronounce it. So.
I bet.
I don't get pressure.
Now, you're a well-known person. You came up through modelling. You know, Miss Great Britain and all the other things that you did. How did you get into all of that?
I was actually spotted. I was at university studying economics, and I was spotted outside Leicester Square Hippodrome. Gosh, it's like 26 years ago, I think, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
I was 18 at the time, and I was invited to take part in the competition. I did. I won it. I was taking a year out to go to Miss Universe, and I decided not to go back. I ended up doing page 3.
Which now, I mean, you know, that was 20 odd years ago.
Yes, yeah. Before PC times, it was like a time of fun. It was enjoyable. And
did you have any problem doing that?
No, not at all. At the time,
not what economics graduates normally.
No, I hadn't even sunbathed topless on the beach at that point. I didn't tell my parents. They found out when someone from my dad's bowling club called him and said, "I think your daughter's in the sun." So they called me. I said yes. He's like, all right, hang on a minute. Put the phone down. But they were okay with it, I think, because they realised I wasn't going to go off the rails or anything like that, and had my head screwed on. They were fine with it in the end.
I mean, society is very different today, isn't it? We're very much more judgmental about those things. I think a lot of people would say we've moved on. Do you think it's right we've moved on from the days of page 3?
The thing is with page 3 is I always felt it was like just silly. It was just boobs. It was fun. I mean, the amount of filth that you can see, that kids can see at the touch of a button on their phones now.
That's a fair point.
You know, it's unbelievable. I mean, that's really, I think there's far more damaging stuff out there now, and even on social media with some of the kids, you know. So I just guess it's a different world. Everything's so offensive.
So is it all a bit of a double standard in some ways?
I think so. I was actually living in Los Angeles at the time they stopped page 3, so I didn't even know it was happening. I came back to England, opened the paper, and I thought, oh, it's not there anymore. But it gave me a lot of good life lessons. You know, I learnt not to take things at face value. I don't just listen to what I hear. I research it. You know, people's work. I need to see actions, not just words. And I also learnt about the media and how the media can create stories. So, for example, I would do silly things with photographers. I'd meet them in the week. I'd pretend to be falling out of a nightclub drunk, and then he would sell the pictures at the weekend. So we were setting things up. Another thing, I laid by a pool reading a self-help book, which we just got as a prop, and it made a story. So I see how the media can create stories. So you take the Canada trucker protest.
Yeah.
You know, and there's some guy has a picture of somebody walking through with his face fully covered holding a Nazi flag. I mean, was it set up? You know, I find it hard to believe that those things were actually genuine.
All of the stuff you did, you know, Miss Great Britain, page 3, gave you profile. In terms of current affairs and politics, you know, you've been incredibly strongly opposed to lockdown, to mandates. I mean, is this political campaigning, is this another political campaign for you, or is this the first time you've involved yourself as publicly in something?
Well, I never saw it as political at the time. See, I was probably a little bit nervous as well during the first couple of weeks of lockdown, because...
Which was reasonable.
Yeah, people were falling... Yeah. The media had people falling over in the streets in China. But 2 weeks in, my friend's 94-year-old grandma got COVID. She also had dementia, and she also had cancer, and she survived. And I thought, the media aren't reporting this thing. All they want to do is push fear and death, even though 99.9% of people, you know, were surviving it. And going back to my fiancé, when I met him 5 years ago, he had cancer. And when people called him up, they didn't say, oh, hi, Billy, my mate's just died of COVID, or my friend's grandma's just died, or my friend's cousin's workmate just died of cancer. They didn't say that. They said, look, gave him positive words of encouragement, told him how alternative ways to try and make himself fit better, heal himself, put him in touch with other people that survived. So it didn't make sense that there was all this fear and nothing positive, or nothing about how to enhance your health. And I don't just mean diet and exercise. I mean, stress causes a negative impact on your health.
Well,
the negativity itself.
I mean, age obviously has been a very major factor in those that have died. And you're right. I mean, a lot of people died with COVID, but some did die of it, and we have to acknowledge that. Weight, clearly a very major factor on this. Pre-existing chest conditions, obviously, certainly with the earlier variants. But the vaccine came along, and we saw the graphics today from Sir Chris Whitty. You know, he was with his charts and his graphs. And
reminding people to wash their hands like they never did that before COVID.
Well, do you know what? Actually, I tell you what, seriously, I think one thing we have learned is the importance of that, and maybe we had forgotten it. So that's not a bad thing culturally that may come out of this. But I completely get your opposition to further lockdowns and to the fact they went on as long as they did. I'm with you. When it comes to the mandates, you know, I've been absolutely appalled at what's happened to our care workers, and I'm delighted that we appear to have overturned.
Yes,
the NHS.
no, absolutely.
I think the Canadians, the truckers, I mean, to me, that's a human rights protest.
Absolutely.
So I'm with you on lots of this.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the vaccine itself, you know, you've called it a world experiment, an untested thing. I mean, you are pretty much in the anti-vax camp, aren't you?
Well, OK, so I haven't had the vaccine myself. I won't have it. I was open to it at the start. I said, if I see, you know, if I see long term, it's OK, I might. But it's been 2 years. I haven't even caught COVID. So I'm only anti it for myself. My parents have had it. Mm-hmm. I didn't say anything to them about having it. You know, that was their decision.
Do you accept the graphs that Whitty put up tonight? And by the way, when it comes, and Sally Cutler made a comment later on, which I don't think can be substantiated, at least I can't see any evidence for it. She said, oh, well, having the vaccine, you know, makes you less likely to catch it or spread it. I don't believe that for a moment.
No.
In fact, I've seen evidence to the contrary.
Right.
So I'm absolutely certain that having 3 jabs, 4 jabs, and goodness knows where it ends, doesn't stop you getting COVID, doesn't stop you spreading COVID.
Right.
Which is the main reason I'm against the mandates.
Yes.
But do you not believe the data that says that if you have the vaccine and you catch COVID, you're much less likely to get seriously ill?
Well, To be honest,
because I do believe that.
I've only really paid attention to the mandates because I've always been somebody that's about, your free choice. And if I've posted things that show like side effects or people getting ill from it or anything else to do with the vaccine, or even the fact, that pharmaceutical companies have paid out the largest criminal fines, all of that. So when I've posted that, it's not to say don't get it, it's to say just know what you're getting, have informed consent, make sure you know everything about it. Because, I don't know if you know this, I was censored on Instagram and I've been banned on Facebook.
I know. And some of this has been very alarming.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I was actually censored for was talking about a $53 million lawsuit in Australia for a horse vaccine for people that were forced to give this vaccine to their horses. And it's a legitimate lawsuit happening now, and a lot of the horses died. So it wasn't even to do with the COVID vaccine. It was to do with a lawsuit for horses.
But anybody that went against World Health Organization recommendations, and if they persistently did this on social media, was likely to find themselves.
And that's another thing. So I also did it at the start.
Which, by the way, I'm not approving of. No, I'm approving of fair, reasoned debate.
But that's the thing,
People having different opinions, and I'm not for incitement, and I'm not for misinformation, but I am for debate and opinion, Now, the other big issue of recent years, it's funny, isn't it? Because 31st of January, 2020, at 11 p.m, we left the European Union. And that day was the first reported case of COVID in the United Kingdom. And kind of the sort of COVID kind of ended the Brexit wars completely. But they got on for years and years and years. But you were very much on the opposite side to me in that, weren't you?
Do you know what? I was a Remainer, but after today, seeing that we're the first country in Europe, we're not in the EU, but we're in Europe, to have dropped all these restrictions actually makes me see that, it is great that we can make our own decisions. And maybe I was wrong. And I don't mind, I'll probably be saying I'm wrong for the first time in 2 years, but I'll say I'm wrong here. I think it's a great thing that we have been able to make our own decisions. And I just hope that we never take a step back and go back into lockdown.
So for all of the battles of the last 2 years, for all of the passion that you put into this, today is a good day, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But we still need to look at America and Australia and try and support the people there that just want freedom and choice.
What about Canada?
Canada.
What about New Zealand, and Western Australia, where they appear to have gone absolutely bonkers? Leilani, thank you very much indeed for joining me on Talking Points. Very good to see you.
And this is Pimm's, by the way, not beer.
Very good. Thank you for joining me. So the other piece of breaking news in the last hour or so is that Vladimir Putin has conducted a press conference where he recognizes the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, why is that significant? Well, both of those provinces are there inside the Donbass region. Both of those provinces are in Ukraine. They're heavily contested areas. They've been heavily fought over areas. They are overwhelmingly Russian-speaking. And they asked for the Russians to recognize their independence. Putin has done that. Is that a pretext? Is that a pretext for Putin putting soldiers into those two provinces? I don't know. What I do know is that the Russians have issued a significant number of passports to people in those provinces. And it could be that he makes the argument that he's had to send military assistance in to protect Russian citizens. Is this what Joe Biden meant when he talked a few weeks ago about a limited incursion? I rather thought then that it might be. Watch this space. That would be very different, of course, to the biggest conflict the world has faced since 1945, which is what Boris Johnson was saying, and indeed the US State Department have been saying. We'll just simply have to see. But that is the news today. I can't pretend that it's particularly good or joyous news, but maybe if Russian troops are to go into the Ukraine, I think it's pretty clear where they're going to go. I still don't see an all-out assault on Kiev. Now, we've got time for a couple of last questions before we head off this evening. It is time now for Barrage the Farage. So let's see what you've sent in to me today. Malcolm asks me, how much are Russia and China hand in glove with the situation in the Ukraine? One of the most distressing things about this is that actually China and Russia are getting closer. They're linking hands, even though in trade terms, China is having Russia over in many ways, although they're still buying some of their gas. But I just think our lack of flexibility on this NATO question, which regular viewers to the programme know, I think we should just say Ukraine is not joining NATO. We have no strategic interest in doing that. We'll defend NATO as an ally, but not and we'll give them assistance, but we're not going to have it in NATO. And that's driven Russia and China closer, which is very bad news. Colin asks, should England get a vote on independence from Scotland and Wales? No, I don't think we should. I know a lot of London cabbies now think we should. They're tired of throwing lots of money over Hadrian's Wall as they see it. I don't think we can do that. Let's have a go at one last question. Here we go. One viewer asks, would you consider forming a dream team with Lord Frost to give us the true Brexit and independence that we voted for? I have to say, I think Lord Frost has done brilliantly. A piece that he wrote in the Telegraph over the weekend. And whether it's on, lockdowns, whether it's on free markets, whether it's on the independence of the individual, whether it's on finishing Brexit properly, which Boris doesn't appear to be interested in any way at all, I would work with Lord Frost in any capacity because he's a true believer in Brexit. Is the Prime Minister? That really is the question, I guess. Right, Mark Stein in a moment. Let's go to the weather, and I hope my electricity stays on tonight. I really do.
Good evening. Storm Franklin may have cleared away, but the weather remains pretty lively. We're going to see a spell of heavy rain sinking south quite quickly during tomorrow and further strong winds throughout this week, although not as stormy as last week. The most recent storm, Franklin, has cleared away, a brief bump in the isobars, bringing many a fine evening, but here come the next set of weather fronts, this already introducing cloud and patchy rain to Northern Ireland. That'll trickle into western Scotland. Further east with clear skies, those winds ease off, turning quite chilly out there, but actually temperatures tending to rise as we go through the night as the cloud moves in. And so we start to see some heavy rain for western Scotland, Northern Ireland by morning, and the winds then start to pick up here once more. On to Tuesday's details. It generally starts pretty grey. Heavy rain early on for Northern Ireland and southern Scotland, but it's pretty much gone by rush hour. It will be quite wet across northern England and Wales. That rain tending to fizzle out as it slips through the Midlands and then turns things a bit damp across East Anglia and the southeast for the early afternoon. Sunny skies will follow. So will a few showers, mostly over northwest England, a few for Northern Ireland, plenty for western Scotland, where there'll be snow over the hills. Those wintry showers will keep going through Tuesday evening. Otherwise, many places dry and clear, and with light winds again, it'll turn quite cold. And then the next weather front arrives in the northwest, again picking the winds up here once more and bringing more rain across much of Scotland as we start Wednesday. Through the day on Wednesday, that rain will spread into Northern Ireland. Much of England and Wales looking dry on Wednesday. A few showers in the west, quite a bit of cloud here, but some sunny spells likely across the east. But it will be a blustery day once more on Wednesday. Again, not as windy as today, but nevertheless noticeable, 8, 9, 10 Celsius, but feeling colder with those gusty winds. So windy this week, but not as stormy. Further spells of rain, but there will be some sunnier days as well. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m.